Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Lawvere, and I'm joined with my co-host, Chris Crawford. Well, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Lawvere, and I have with me Chris Crawford as my co-host, and we have special guest Derek Melton. So, Chris, if you want to take it away, you can start the interview process, and Derek, feel free to ask us questions as you see fit.
Yeah, will do. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks, Aaron. And so I'll just say a little bit about Derek. I mentioned him in our first podcast that Derek and I have known each other since high school, and we kind of got into knife making together. And I'm not going to say too much about that. I'll let him tell how he remembers it, and then we can go back and compare, see if we remembered it the same way. We're both getting older, and it's been, golly, Derek, man, it's been 21 years, I guess.
I'm 50, man. I'm 50 years old.
I just turned 52 this past week, so we'll see. It'll be like the Newlywed Game or something. see if we remember it right. But so tell us a little bit about yourself outside of knives, like what you do for a living, where you live, and just some general information, so that people who don't know you can kind of get to know your background just a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I live in central Mississippi, right in the middle of the state, just west of Jackson, Mississippi. So Jackson is the capital, and I live or just north of a town called Clinton. And Clinton is basically a suburb of Jackson. And I've been here since 1990, I think. I moved down here to go to school and just never left. But been here. This is home for quite a long time. I've got a wife and two kids. I've got a son who is in his second year of college, and I've got a daughter who is in her senior year of high school. My wife works at the local college here, and I work at a hospital nearby as an IT analyst. So primarily my day job is as a support analyst for a large hospital system. So that's kind of my life outside of the making that I do.
And in addition to knowing Derek in high school, we went to college together, and we worked at a company called MTEL together, and then we worked at that same hospital that he's talking about together. But I left there a long time ago when we moved to Tupelo. But yeah, so we have a pretty good history together, and Derek's one of my best friends. So you do a lot of blacksmithing now. We'll get to that in just a little bit, but tell us a little bit about how you got started in knife making. Like when did you get interested in knives? Was that as a kid? And what point did you decide you wanted to make knives?
Yeah, so I don't really remember as a kid, like I really don't remember thinking about making a knife before I was in college. I mean, like most boys, I had phases where I would like grab a stick and scratch it on the sidewalk and turn it into a spear and run off in the woods and pretend and do that kind of stuff. And um, my parents were divorced at a young age, and my dad dated this woman for a while, and I remember she had a decorative sword in her house, and we went over there one time, and I remember I got that sword out. It was just purely a decorative thing that she had leaning on her fireplace, and she had two girls, but she didn't have any boys in the house. And man, I remember the first time we went over there, I found that sword, and I grabbed that thing and snuck out of their house and went behind their house with it and started swinging around. And she was so mad because I had beat it up against this fence. But so that's my first experience with
you
the
returned the sword?
But yeah, it was. Yeah, it didn't have a good heat treat. Yeah, it was fairly beat up after I was done with it. But I think the first time I really caught the bug to make knives, or really was ever exposed to the idea of making your own knife, was when I was at Mississippi College, probably my second or third year there was a guy named Ramsey Green, and his father was my Greek teacher. And anyway, Ramsey, if I remember it right, Ramsey had a handmade knife, and I remember it looking unusual. And so I asked him about it, and he said, well, he had made it. And I was just kind of blown away. I was like, how did you make your own knife? How does that work? What's that like? And a few weeks later, he took me to his house and showed me his little backyard forge that he had set up. And we didn't make a knife that day. He made an arrowhead for me. He took a piece of steel and beat it into the shape of an arrowhead and textured it with a ball peen hammer so it looked like it was flint knapped, but it was steel. And that was the first time I had seen forging in person. And he gave me that little arrowhead, and I've still got that thing somewhere. It's I think it's in a little cigar box full of knickknacks around here, but that was my first time to see any kind of forging, and then I learned about the Mississippi Forge Council group, which is a local Urbana chapter, and I started going to those meetings primarily because I was interested in knife making, and it was the only place that bladesmiths were kind of gathering at that time. This was before, really before internet was big. It was before, you know, there was a whole lot of there just wasn't a whole lot of media out there, so to speak, with in regards to bladesmithing. So if you wanted to learn it, you had to go and find people that were doing it. And that was the place where I could see it, was at the Forge Council. And so I went to those meetings and hooked up with several people there. And that was the first time I met Terry Vandeventer, who is now a master bladesmith with the ABS here in the state. And I think I met Bruce Evans through that group too, by going over to the Batson bladesmithing show in Alabama. Like, I think the first time I went to Batson was because I heard about it through the Forge Council. And when I went to the Batson bladesmithing symposium over in Tannehill State Park, Alabama, right outside of Birmingham, that was really where I started meeting more bladesmiths and learning more about it. And really, that's where I really caught the bug, was after attending Batson's. And then from there, I started gathering tools up, and I bought my first anvil from a guy at the Forge Council, and started scrapping around, finding what tools I could get, and put together a little forge in our first home. My wife and I were married right out of college, and we had a little house, and I had my first forge was set up on two sawhorses in our carport with a little single burner gas forge, an anvil, and one cross peen hammer, one set of tongs, and a vise that I had bolted down to the sawhorses, and that's kind of how I got started. And then once I kind of got my equipment together, I met another guy here in town, Steve Thompson, and Steve allowed me to come over to his place, which was he had a bladesmith shop in a U-Haul self-storage facility. So, like one of these storage places where you rent, the places with like a roll-up door, you rent like a 10 by 10 cube, and you fill it with all your stuff and pay him a monthly fee. Well, he knew somebody that owned the place, and they let him. He had a full-fledged bladesmith shop inside that storage place, and so he was probably the first guy to really tutor me in bladesmithing. And I think my first or second knife I made with him in that little shop.
So this was, I'm guessing this was probably 2001, 2002. Does that sound about right?
Yes, like the first knife I've got any mark on has has '01 scratched in it with an engraver. You know those little engraver pens you used to get, that those buzzer kind of pens? Yeah, that's how I etched my first knife. Was I engraved the date on that knife. And so, well, it has my initials DEM and '01 scratched into it. It's awful. But yeah, that was 2001.
Going back, so you met, so okay, I didn't realize this. You met Ramsey while you were in college, so you were exposed to custom knife making even back then, right?
Yeah, I think it was either it was my second or third, or my third or fourth year at MC. I saw Ramsey with that knife, and he was the first guy that let me see forge work being
Right.
done,
And then
you know.
Ramsey, if I remember right, he learned from Terry. Is that correct? Or he would snake hunt with Terry. There was some
I'm not
relationship
sure.
between him and Terry.
That sounds right. Yeah, that sounds
And
right.
but
Yeah.
then I think I was saying on our podcast earlier that my first introduction to it was when you sent me that link to Jones's Cheapskate Guide to Knife Making. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that one, but I remember the $50 knife
Well,
shop.
I was going to ask
That
you
was
about
my
that in just a second. I'll ask you about that next. But yeah,
yeah.
you sent me an internet link. It was called something like, I found it the other day. I found it in PDF, and I may have the title wrong, but it was something like Jonesy's Absolute Cheapskate Guide to Making Knives. And
Gosh, I, I have I have no memory of that.
I'll send it back to you. And so you were, I think I told this on our podcast, but I'm going to tell it again just to bust your chops here. But I was working remote from St. Dominic and coming over there, once a week or once every couple of weeks. And we're sitting there in your office and you were talking about, oh, I'm going to make a knife. I'm going to make a knife. And I pulled that one out, the one that I'd made. And I was like this? I'd use that guide that
Yeah.
you'd sent. But anyway, so yeah. So
Beat me to it.
yeah, I was trying to chump you. All right. So you mentioned Wayne Goddard. And so that's one thing I was going to ask you about. Talk about the influence. Talk about, I don't know if people who have come into knife making now are familiar with Wayne Goddard or his book, The $50 Knife Shop, but talk about
Yeah.
how big of a part that knife played in your getting started. And then talk about your first grinder.
Yeah. So if most people that have come into knife making since Forged in Fire, let's just say since the first season of Forged in Fire, which they're starting to film season 10 now. So, that's 7, 8 years, I think. I want to say that he died about 4 years ago, and he had been inactive a good while before he passed. But if you haven't come into if you've just recently come into knife making in the last 10 to 15 years, you probably don't know who Wayne Goddard is. And Wayne Goddard was, he's a master bladesmith with the ABS, but he wrote articles for Blade magazine years and years ago, and he did a series of articles that he titled, I forget what the title of the articles were, but he took all those articles and pulled them together into a book that he called The $50 Knife Shop. And I don't remember who recommended that book to me. I don't remember how I came across it, but I do remember that it was right around the time that me and Steve Thompson were working together, and I was just getting started in knife making. And I got that book, and it changed my world. That book opened up the world of making your own tools to me. Because that book, the premise of that book was he wanted to see if he could put together all the tools needed to make his own knife for $50. And so he went around and pulled a motor out of a washing machine and turned it into a grinder, and he used a pawn shop hand drill with a flap disc attachment on it to grind bevels. He just very rudimentary, basic, equipment that anybody could scrap together. And that was the first time that I really thought, man, I could, I don't have to have all this crazy equipment. I can make a knife with this basic stuff. And so I bet I read that book cover to cover probably 4 or 5 times right after I got it, because it had everything from how to forge a knife, how to grind a knife, how to heat treat a knife. And in the very back of the book, there was a section on building your own belt grinder. And even, the belt grinder is kind of the holy grail of knife maker tools when you're getting started. When you're just getting started in bladesmithing or knife making, whether it's stock removal or forged blades, especially nowadays, there's all these really nice grinders on the market. You're just not going to avoid seeing all these people with these fancy grinders. Well, back then, the fancy grinder was the Bader B3 or the Burr King. And those two machines were thousands of dollars. They were way out of reach of where I was at. And so Wayne had this section in the back of his book where he built this grinder that he called the grinder from junk. Or he had I think it was the grinder from junk, but then he wound up calling it Big Red or something like that because it was red in color by the time he got done with it. But he took all these weird parts and pieces and put together a belt grinder, and I I was just fascinated by it. And so I thought, well, if he can do it from this, from these parts and pieces, well, certainly I can do it. And so I started looking around for different things that I could use to make a grinder, and we were throwing a desk away at work, like this office desk. And this office desk was sitting in the back room near the dumpster, just waiting to be thrown away. And I noticed that it was made out of square steel tubing. And so I took that office desk to the house and took an angle grinder and cut all the square tubing up into, little short 12 to 14-inch sections. And I used the pictures and the guides from the back of that book and put together my own grinder frame. I didn't have a welder. I did have a drill press. I bought like one of those $49 drill presses at Harbor Freight. And so I used a drill press and a ton of nuts and bolts to bolt all those tubes together. And then I found a refurbished, I went to grizzly.com because Grizzly had just come out with their 2x72 knife grinder. And they had refurbished contact wheels. You could get the 8-inch contact wheel that they had for their grinder. And I bought a refurbished contact wheel from Grizzly. And then I contacted Rob Beaumont at Beaumont Metalworks. And they were just starting to make grinder parts. They weren't really well known then for their grinders, and I contacted him and had him make me an idler wheel, a crowned idler wheel. And I took all that stuff and bought a big spring at the hardware store for tension and made a really crazy tracking mechanism that was basically held together with JB Weld. And I put my own 2x72 together from the back of that book, and I was off and running. And man, I used that grinder for 15 years. I mean, I used it for a long time.
Isn't that the grinder that my buddy Brian bought from you, or was that
It
a different
is,
one?
yeah.
Okay.
No, that's the one. So he's still got it. It's still going somewhere, But that book was so instrumental to me getting started because it was just everything I needed, and it was written in such a way that it was really approachable, and it put it kind of into the hands of anybody that wanted to give it a shot. And so to this day, if somebody asks me what they need to get started, one of the first things I recommend to them is that book. And some of the heat treat info in that book is a little outdated, but it's still an excellent resource, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And one of my great regrets my great regrets in my knife making career is that I never got to meet Wayne Goddard in person and say thank you, because it was just such an instrumental book.
People like him, books like that, it'll never be known how many people got their start with that. Back then I think Wayne Goddard had a couple of books, and then you had Ed Fowler's Knife Talk and Knife Talk 2. And those were kind of like the, popular books to get started. And there were some other books as well. But Aaron, do you have that book, $50 Knife Shop? Are you familiar
Yeah,
with
I'm
it?
familiar with it, but I actually I don't have a
Man,
copy of
I've
it.
I've bought that book and sent it to probably a half a dozen people.
Yeah, well, something that you guys have to realize is that I'm 35. I'll be 36 in April. So by the time I came around, knew how to use YouTube and research the Googles and things. So I mean, buying books as part of knife making, although I do have a copious amount of books on knife making, that's one I didn't have because there was a lot of YouTubers and like Walter Sorrell's videos and things
Oh
that
yeah,
encompassed a
yeah.
lot of those
Yeah.
basics early on for me. So
Yeah, I can imagine coming into knife making in the last 15 years or so, having access to the internet and like blade forums and YouTube and all that is just you've almost got too much information.
Well, back in 2001, I mean, if you remember 2001, 2002, I mean, you already had blade forums and you had knife forums,
Yeah.
but that was it. I mean, that was it. That is, there was no Facebook, or Instagram. So knowledge was shared among knife makers in the forums like that. And so you got your start back in around 2001, and you're doing blacksmithing now, but have you been active for the last 21 years, or has it come and gone, or how's that
Active, what do you
going?
mean?
Like consistent. Like right now, I would say you're a very consistent maker. I mean, that's what you do. But has it always been that way, or has there been times where you kind
Well,
of got
I
out of it
mean,
and got back
you
into it?
so the audience won't know my dad, but you remember my father,
Mm-hmm.
and like my dad was a maker, for lack of a better
Yeah, I
word.
didn't know
He
that.
was a carpenter. Yeah, and so my dad was a carpenter. Um, he was a draftsman. He was an architect. He drew house plans and he contracted and helped build custom homes. That was his great passion, was designing and building custom homes. But his hobby on the side was fine woodworking, and so he, wherever we went, he always had a little woodworking shop at the house, and so he made furniture, he made all kinds of stuff, and for a long time in the 80s he was really into military model making, um, like tanks and airplanes. And he got so good at making these military dioramas where you have a tank and like fake grass and, like crumbling brick, basically these battle scenes that he would build together. He got so good at building these battle scenes with plastic models. He was competing in these model competitions in Memphis. He got so good at it, they refused to let him compete anymore, because he was winning every one of the model making competitions in the southeast area, and so they forced him to not compete anymore, and so then he turned back to his woodworking, and for a while he got really into making uh, really fine hardwood briefcases,
Really?
custom briefcases. Yeah, and I've got one of them in the shop. I'll try to take a picture of it. But anyway, my point to all that was I always saw him with tools in his hand, either working on his models, painting with an X-Acto knife, shaving plastic, or working on those things, or he was out in the shop making a piece of furniture or working on one of his briefcases. Um, he made a bunch of little jewelry boxes too out of really nice hardwood, and so from a very early age, I was around my dad and watching him make things. And as I grew up, I just found that was something I really enjoyed too. And so I think I've always been a maker. Like I was making furniture for people in high school. it was for gifts and things, Um, and I've made furniture pieces around our house, and I've done all kinds of woodwork around our house. But when I found metalwork, that was kind of what clicked for me, and that was where I felt like, oh man, this is kind of my groove here, and and so I would say I've always been consistent in making things, but I didn't find my groove until probably my late 30s, being like, oh, this is what I want to really learn to be good at, and that was forge work.
Well, speaking of forging, and you mentioned this already, Forged in Fire. So you were on Forged in Fire. Was it season 5? Is that right? Or season 8, episode
Yeah,
5? Which was it?
season 5, episode 20,
Season 5,
and
episode
my
20.
episode was called "The Small Sword." And at that time, a lot of the episodes were themed around certain movies or shows, and our episode was themed around Game of Thrones, and our weapon was uh, a small sword, which was based around a weapon in that series called a needle, that a little girl named Arya uses. And so I had to make a small sword based on that.
Tell us about your experience of going on the show, going out there, about them coming to your shop, and then just give us a little bit about your overall thought of the show in general as to how the influence that it's had on knife making, whether you feel that's positive or negative. Just share a little bit about that, because I know you've done. I think you even put up like a web page or something just about your experience on the show, didn't you?
Yeah, so I've got a website, just derekmelton.com, where I have several different pages out there, and one of them is my Forged in Fire experience. And I went through and I was detailing. I was really trying to write down my experience as it was fresh in my mind right after I was back home from it. I wanted to document it because I knew I'd forget it, and so I went through and started kind of documenting day by day through the process. And I was posting all these pictures, the screenshots from the episode, and one of the people from the Forged in Fire um, company, or maybe it was History Channel, I don't know who it was, but they reached out and they said, hey, you can't use those screenshots. And so they made me take down pretty much all the media that I had put up, and it kind of sucked the wind out of me documenting that process. And so there is some info out there about my experience from the show, still on my website. But I applied in season 2, and went all the way through the interview process, but then just never heard back. And then and kind of put it out of my mind. I didn't think much more about it. I thought, well, it was an interesting experience trying to get on the show, and I remained a fan of the show and kept watching. And then right before season 5, I got an email from the casting people, and they said, "Hey, are you still interested?" And I said, "Sure." And so I went through the interview process again, and was told, "Hey, we would like you to be on this season." And so I got a spot on season 5, and I think that was like in November or December that I found out that I was going to be on the show. And they said, "Hey, we're gonna start filming soon, and we'll let you know. We'll try to give you 2 weeks notice before you have to fly out, and it'll be sometime between January and June." And so I was like, "Okay, well." And so I was kind of on pins and needles for that whole time period, not knowing when they were going to call. And so what I did from January until April, when I went to film, is I tried to practice. I tried to watch the show and see what kind of challenges they were doing, and practice a little bit as I could in the shop. And then a couple of weeks before our film date, I got a phone call, and they said, "Hey, you're going to fly out on this date. Here's your plane tickets." And they gave me the details about it, and so I flew out in April, filmed the show. It takes a full week to film the first 2 parts of the show. The until the last 2 are standing. Um, you get there on a Sunday night, and they pick you up at the airport, drive you to a really nice hotel in Connecticut, in Stamford, and then Monday morning they pick you up from the hotel and carry you to the studio, which is this nondescript industrial looking building right in the middle of a big industrial park. And then you film the sections of the show all through the week, and you're required to stay there all week, regardless of when you're eliminated or if you're not eliminated. If you're the first guy out on Tuesday morning, you still have to stay in the hotel there all week. And so we went through, the four of us, and filmed throughout the week. Got to be good friends with the guys that filmed the episode with me. And then we left on a Friday, and then they came back and filmed the Home Forge section, which happened over a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I had 48 hours over 5 days. So I had 4 10-hour days, and I had 1 8-hour day to do my work. And the film crew that showed up was just 2 people. It's just a guy and a girl, and it's basically a camera operator and a footage editor, for lack of a better way to describe their titles. But it was a really fun experience. I really had a great time. Obviously, winning helps with your perception of the experience, But I think even the people that go on the show that don't make it all the way to the end, by and large, the people that I've spoken to who have been on the show had a good time. I mean, obviously, there's a few people that I've talked to that didn't enjoy the experience, or felt like they didn't do as well as they wanted to, or caught a bad break. And, that's really that's the one thing that I would stress about that show, is that regardless of your skill level, anybody can win that show and anybody can lose. Some of the most talented people in the country have been on that show and have gone home in round 1 or 2. And that has no bearing on their capabilities as makers. It just means that the rules or the circumstances just didn't play out in their favor. And I'll be the first to say that there was a large amount of luck or things going right that helped me to make it to the end. But, I went into that process with the mindset that I wanted to win. I didn't want to go and just kind of be lazy about it. I wanted to go in there and be competitive. And so I felt like I was. And then the other goal was to not do anything really stupid.
I'd recommend anyone interested to go back and watch your episode, season 5, episode 20. It's a really good episode. And I'm not just saying that because he's a good friend of mine, but the sword that he made was a beautiful sword, and it performed so well. And it was just, you did a really good job.
The show does get a fair amount of hate from some parts of the bladesmithing community because, there are some things about the show that are silly. There's some NASCAR crash aspects of the show where, they want people go to a NASCAR race a lot of times to see the crashes, or you hear that said, and Forged in Fire is kind of like that. The disasters and the drama are what people want to watch. They want to see, the suspense of something that could go wrong. And so I think that the show puts people in position so that at least 3 people are going to fail at some point in the show, and so it gets a bad rap because I think some people feel like it puts a negative light on bladesmithing. However, I can't think of anything else that's brought as much attention to forging blades in my lifetime than Forged in Fire. And so I don't think there's a good argument there to say that it's been a negative influence on bladesmithing. And I think the people that wind up saying things like it's been bad for bladesmithing are people that are yearning for the quote good old days. end quote. They're longing for the time when it was a smaller group. And in my opinion, that's a bit of a gatekeeping mindset, and I'm just not a big fan of that. And I think the more people that get into bladesmithing, the better for bladesmithing, because, it's a hard craft. And for every 10 people that get excited from watching the show and getting into it, really, realistically, maybe one or two people are going to stick with it once they get into it and figure out, oh man, this is hard work. It's hot. It's dirty, and there's a lot of failure involved, And so, I don't know. I think it's been a net positive for bladesmithing in general. I had a great time doing it. I made really good friends through the process and after the process. Like, there are people that I've met who are other contestants on the show that I would call really close friends now, and the only tie we have is that we were both on this TV show. And so there's a brotherhood kind of about it.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There seems to be a brotherhood among the contestants, not just the champions, but
Yeah,
just the
absolutely.
contestants in general. And kind of going along the same lines that you're saying, it has opened up the world of knife making to people who would have maybe never seen it otherwise. But not just to the makers, but also there's a lot of people who just enjoy watching the show that aren't planning on making a knife, but they are now exposed to this realization that, hey, there's a craft out here. There's people doing this kind of stuff where they may have never known that or
Yeah.
never realized that before. Let me ask you kind of follow up with that. So without going into too much detail, I know that that you have definitely benefited from being on the show. Number one, we've talked about this before, you and I, but just that week that week in your home shop, and it forced you very quickly to become a better maker. But talk about some of the extended benefits that have come just from the fact of being on the show, and that may not have come as quickly had you not taken the time to go on the
Yeah,
show
well,
that week.
the show will force you to do things outside of your comfort zone, and so that was a real positive thing. I had never made anything like the sword that I made on the show before the show. I had not done that, and so being put in a situation where you have to stretch yourself like that, that's a good thing, and that set me up to do that more in the future, because it kind of inspired me to look back at what I did and say, well, I did that. Why shouldn't I try to do this thing? And so that's definitely a net positive that came out of it. The social media exposure that happened after the show generally happens to everybody that wins on the show. But I will say this about the exposure, it's what you make of it. There have been people that have gone on the show and have won real big, and they don't take advantage of it, or they may not know how to take advantage of it. And so I tried to take advantage of that brief bit of exposure, and to use it to get my name out there a little bit more, and it did. And so that was also a net positive. But also too, there have been people that have gone on the show that have not won, and they've taken advantage of social media and skyrocketed as well. So it is what you make of it, to a large degree.
I have one more question about Forged in Fire, and then we'll move on. But this came to my mind while you were talking about that, because I don't think it got a whole lot of exposure on the show. But share with everybody the problem you had to solve with tempering your sword.
Okay, so yeah, the guy that filmed the episode right before me, episode 19. If you watch that episode, there's a disaster that happens where the guy wants to do an oil bath temper on his sword. He basically has the idea where he wants to build a pipe, fill it with oil, and heat the oil to 400 degrees, and put the sword into the oil and let it be the temper. medium. And when he does that, the oil boils over, reaches its flash point, and basically he threw a flamethrower to his ceiling and burned his shop down. And so the very first question that the producer asked me when he came to my shop was, "How are you going to temper your sword?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really sure yet, but this is my idea." And I showed him my idea, which was I bought 3 toaster ovens from Walmart, cut holes in the sides of them, and stacked them side by side. And then I built little metal tubes to connect all the toaster ovens and wrapped those tubes with ceramic blanket so that I had a 36-inch long tempering oven. And so that was the idea behind, or that was the idea for tempering. And I can't take full credit for it. I mean, if you know who Salem Straub is a phenomenal bladesmith. Salem Straub had done the same thing with, I think, 2 little propane ovens, like camper ovens. He had stuck them side by side to get some extra length. And so it had been done before, but I just did it with some really cheap Walmart toaster ovens, and it worked. It worked perfectly. I put little oven thermometers in each of the toaster ovens and calibrated the ovens so that they were accurately representing the temperatures that they should, and tempered that 32-inch blade, made a 5160 just perfectly. And I called it the Ghetto Heat Treat 3000, I think, or something like that. And I was super proud of that thing and super excited about it being on the show. And yeah, they didn't show it. They didn't talk about it. There's not a single picture of it on the show.
It was really neat. I did get to see it, and it was a good idea. That's really cool. All right, well let's move on from knives and let's talk about blacksmithing. You're doing a lot of blacksmithing now, so tell me a little bit about your transition from knives to blacksmithing. What was it that drew you to blacksmithing, and why do you feel like that you've gravitated more to that and kind of put knife making? I know you still make a knife every now and then, but as a whole, you've pretty much moved off of knife making for blacksmithing. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So right after Forged in Fire, I got a bunch of people requesting knives. A bunch of people wanted a knife from me, and I made a few, but I just found out that I wasn't having a whole lot of fun doing it. Right around that time, I was also helping Boy Scouts in the Boy Scout troop with the Metalwork Merit Badge, or I was studying to put the Metalwork Merit Badge stuff together, and there was blacksmithing involved in that, and so I met a guy who encouraged me to go on the show. His name is Lyle Wynn, and Lyle is a local blacksmith here in Mississippi. Extremely, extremely talented blacksmith, and he's primarily a tool maker, or he was at the time. He was really into making tools, and he was teaching this curriculum called Tools to Make Tools, which is a tool making curriculum that was popularized and invented by Brian Brazil, which Brian Brazil is a really well known blacksmith and very talented blacksmith. But anyway, I met Lyle Wynn at the Forge Council meetings, and heard that Lyle was teaching this tool making class, and I had never done any of that. And one of the things that you do in this tool making class was you make your own hammer. And I just thought, man, how cool would that be to go and make my own hammer? I want to do that. And so I went and took the tool making class from Lyle over, I think it was 3.5 days. And it changed my world. It was as influential on me as the $50 knife shop was. It's a class where you basically make the tools that you need to make a hammer, and then you make a hammer with those tools, and then afterwards you use those tools to make other things like decorative, items, and um, it's basically a forging fundamentals class. And I had been forging blades for years, but not really forging much else. And this class opened up a whole big world of forging and tool making that I had not really been exposed to. And so I went down the rabbit hole of hammer making for about a year. That was all I wanted to do for a solid year. I wanted to do nothing but make hammers. And so I made hammer after hammer after hammer, big hammers, little hammers. And basically, once I figured out that I could punch a hole into a block of steel and stick a piece of wood in it, all kinds of avenues opened up. All these different tools that you can make, handheld tools, and then it veered off into axe making and sledgehammer making. And then I got into making tongs a little bit, and so that was my start of my venture towards blacksmithing, and I've just kind of been stuck in that blacksmithing world ever since. I love it. I've told people a bunch of times that when the forging stops for me, the fun stops. And that's kind of how I feel about it. When I love forging a blade out, but once I forge a blade out, I'm kind of done with it. I don't want to grind it. I don't want to fool with the handle anymore, and and so I'm just kind of stuck in this world where I'm doing a whole lot of forging steel, and it's just what I really enjoy now. And in the last few years, I got into making barbecue tools, grilling tools, forged grilling tools, and that took off. And so I figured out that I could make and sell a lot more barbecue tools than I could make and sell custom knives, and it allowed me to make money to buy tools that I wanted. And so I kind of just stayed in this lane.
So you're talking about making those barbecue tools. Tell the story about the quote Harry Potter wands that you were making.
Yeah, so I've sold a bunch of Harry Potter wands or steel wands, and that came about. I posted a picture or a video of one of my steak turners on TikTok, and somebody commented that it was a cool wand. I guess they didn't see the hook on the end of it, and they thought it was a wand that I was holding in my hand. And they said something like, "That's a cool wand. I would totally buy that." And so I went out to the shop and made a steak turner, but didn't put the hook. I just left it to a point and called it a wand and put it on my website as a Harry Potter wand, and sold like 4 of them right off the bat. And so I thought, well, that's a standard product now. And so I just used some thinner, narrower diameter steel and did a little different work on the handle, and called it a Harry Potter wand. And yeah, man, I've sold dozens of those things now.
That's funny.
Thank you for listening to the first part of the Derek Melton interview. Stay tuned for next week's episode where we finish up with Derek. And remember, you are loved and God bless.